Okay, well, by now you've probably had a chance to watch the first instalment of our discussions with Viscount Christopher Monckton of Brenchley. In the second half, he's going to go in greater depth into the fallacies that are embodied in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Control's assessment of the influence of man-made carbon dioxide-driven climate change, which he believes they grossly overestimate and minimise the not uncontrollable effects that are outside of our ability to influence.
It's an entertaining view, certainly an entertaining view, and you will enjoy it for various reasons. But give it a watch and let us know what you think. But just remember, the views of Viscount Christopher aren't necessarily those of the Alliance of British Drivers.
Indeed.
Previously on Full Throttle.
In 1984, an appropriate year as you may think,
Yes.
in which he first made this mistake, all of communist academia, because essentially if you go to Cambridge or Oxford or any great university now, it's more or less totally communist dominated.
Yeah.
It's really terrifying. It's a monoculture of unthinking and pathetically acquiescent communism.
Yeah.
And so they all began parroting this mistake. And that's why nobody ever corrected it until my team came along and said, hang on a moment, none of this actually adds up. It doesn't accord with well-established pre-existing theory, which has been proven time and time again in many different fields of physics. And so it was, first of all, a communist who did it. He didn't do it but because he was a communist. He did it because he was stupid. He just didn't know enough of the mathematics and physics of how a feedback amplifier works to get it right. And everybody then copied him and went on and on and on copying him, because it soon became immensely profitable for the climatological establishment. They were previously called meteorologists, and there weren't very many of them. Now they call themselves climatologists. And, you know, they are the stars of TV shows. They go on and they speak to their fellow communists who run the show, and the BBC, to take an example, and they say, oh yes, you know, we're all doomed unless the West, and somehow only the West, shuts itself down. And that raises another question, which is, supposing the whole world, rather than just a few Western countries, no longer now including America, because President Trump's come out of the Paris Accords for a second time, if the whole world actually went in a straight line from their current sins of emission, and that meant something quite other when I was a lad, to you know, what it might be in 100 years' time. How much global warming would they prevent if by 2050, in a straight line, every nation had gone from current emissions to net zero emissions by the target date set by the UN itself? The answer, and until my team did the calculation, nobody had even bothered to ask the question. And it's not a very difficult calculation. The answer is 0.1 Celsius degrees by 2050. Yeah. Yeah. But would you like to know the cost? The cost, based on the one reliable figure we can find, which was that shortly before the ghastly milliband, and you know, the scientific unit of absolute stupidity is the milliband, he decided that he was going to, you know, essentially shut down the British economy. And he hadn't bothered to calculate whether it would make any difference whatsoever if we went to net zero. He hadn't worked out what it would cost. It would cost, if you take the one reliable figure we can find, and that is the cost of net zeroizing just the UK electricity grid, which accounts for 1/4 of all UK emissions, which in turn account for 0.8% of global emissions. The cost of just net zeroizing the UK grid is $3.8 trillion. Yeah. So pro rata, that's $15.2 trillion to net zeroize the whole of the UK economy. And that is $2 quadrillion to net zeroize the global economy. But since you're only going to get virtually no change in global temperature if you do this, every $1 billion that you spend on trying to get to net zero by 2050 would reduce, we're spending $1 billion, it would reduce global temperature by then by 1/20 millionth of a Celsius degree. This is unquestionably the worst value for money in human history. Now, is it even achievable? Well, of course, the answer is no. And the reason for that is that $2 quadrillion is 20 years global GDP, the value of everything the whole world makes and sells and trades over the next 50 years. Would be 20 years worth of everything we make and sell over the next 25 years. So what are we going to live on? And nobody in the department of Nut Zero had done this sum. So I thought, this was 6 months ago, I thought I'd get in touch with the so-called press office. And of course, that next communist tribe. So I rang them up, and some hapless guy who knew the party line but knew absolutely no science or economics. I sent him a list of questions about this. I said, do you accept that these scientific errors have been made? Do you accept, for instance, that the climate behaves as a mathematically chaotic object, which means the very tiniest change in any one of the hundreds of initial conditions that inform the models could cause wild changes in your predictions of global warming down the years? Yeah. These are huge errors, which they haven't allowed for. Yeah. So I said, first of all, there's the scientific questions. There are 3 big ones there. And then you've got these economic questions. And then I said, you've got other questions. Look at the British economy. You will have noticed that this year, somewhere between £1 and £2 billion has been spent on paying wind farm operators and solar panel operators,
not to generate,
to turn off their wretched things. Now, why would they need to do that? And nobody in the press has actually got to the bottom of this. But as you can imagine, my team has done so. And it's beautifully simple. You see, at any given moment, there is a total mean hourly demand on the grid by all the customers, whether they be business customers or domestic customers or us, using electricity to broadcast this podcast. So all this electricity, and there is a total of how much electricity is the total mean, the average hourly demand on the grid. Would you believe that so utterly stupid is Miliband that he has allowed more than 140% of total mean hourly demand to be installed on the grid? 140%. And so every time the sun is shining and the wind is blowing all over the country, and that happens quite a lot, then you have to turn off an absolute minimum of about 1/3 of the entire wind and solar network, because there's too much of it already on the network. And putting any more on the network will make absolutely no difference to the carbon footprint of Britain. Absolutely none. But it will vastly increase the cost of electricity. And the cost of electricity in Britain is now, for businesses, the highest in the world. And it's higher than places like China and Russia and India and Pakistan by 6 times over. This is not a small margin. It means that every manufacturer with any get up and go has had to get up and go. They've gone. They've got up and got out because they can't afford to turn on the machines. And Miliband is deliberately destroying the British economy. Yeah. And this is the thing that is so sinister about it. And now let's move on to a subject which might be dear to your heart, which is the motor car. Yeah. It should go vroom vroom and not chirrup chirrup. And the motor car is a remarkably efficient gadget by now. We've been developing it for more than a century, so we kind of know how to refine it so that you get very good mileage to the gallon, and it's really efficient. But if you replace real cars with these electric buggies that people like Tesla and Build Your Dreams, which is the Chinese big manufacturer, BYD. That's why they call it BYD, Build Your Dreams. It's a kind of propaganda slogan. The trouble with electric buggies is that they weigh between 30% and 100% more than real cars with proper engines. And the result of that, and it's not a difficult calculation, is that you'll be using 30 to 100% more energy to transport goods and people around in cars and lorries and trains, etc. If you go electric, than if you stay with coal, oil and gas, of which we've got plenty in this country. You know, we're not short of coal, oil and gas. We are very short of the rare techno metals that you would need to have, you know, even more wind and solar power, and to have everything powered by these catch fire at the touch of a button, lithium ion batteries everywhere. So, you know, the whole thing makes absolutely no rational sense when you stand back and look at all these aspects. It's not just the science, it's not just the economics, it's also the resource economics. So you have to actually have enough lithium and vanadium and copper and cobalt and all these other rare techno metals to do this pathetic word transition to net zero. And the problem with that is that even to get to one 15-year generation of net zero by having electric buggies and charging networks and electric batteries backing up your wind and solar nonsense, there simply isn't enough of these rare metals on Earth. And this research was done by Professor Simon Michaud at the Geologian Tutkimuskeskus, which is the Finnish Geological Survey. And he gave testimony in front of the House of Lords Economic Committee just a couple of years ago now. And he rang me afterwards and he said, why did their lordships say that I was being negative when I pointed out that in order to get to just one 15-year generation of net zero energy infrastructure worldwide, and then you'd have to do it every 10 to 15 years thereafter because all this technology wears out much more quickly than a coal-fired power station does. He said you would need 9,500 years worth of the entire global annual production of lithium as it is at the moment. And if you want to make vanadium steel for the casings of the batteries, and you want to make vanadium batteries, you're going to need to have 67,000 years worth of vanadium of the global annual production. He said it doesn't exist and it won't exist. It can't be done. And I told their lordships this, and they said I was being negative. That's stupid. The government of this country now is, when it comes to anything scientific, if that scientific measurement or observation goes against the Communist Party line, they reject it out of hand as though it must be incorrect a priori, when in fact, of course, everything that I've told you is verifiably true. And yet Miliband now knows this is true because I sent a detailed briefing to his department on all the points I've mentioned to you 6 months ago. And this communist in the press office came back and said, all these questions that you raise have been debunked. And I said, forgive me, but I framed this document as a series of 25 questions. A question is not a declarative statement. It is not in logic a proposition. It is asking for information. It is not by definition debunkable except by answering the question that was asked. Can I now take it that you realize that you haven't debunked my questions because they are just that, they're questions? Where are you going to get the minerals from to do this? What is going to happen if you go on adding more and more wind and solar power to a grid that is already 40% overloaded with them compared with the total hourly demand on the grid? What's the point? These are reasonable questions. And all I'm asking your department to do is answer them. And he said, oh, well, that's fair enough. I will answer them. And of course he didn't. And 6 times I went back to him and tried to get him to answer them. So now, if he's sitting watching this, which he won't, because of course this doesn't reflect the Communist Party line to which he subscribes, I'm going to report him and Miliband to the anti-corruption unit that they have in the Department of Net Zero, because they have failed to answer these questions, without which the policies they are pursuing have no rational justification whatsoever. They are a gross abuse and waste of taxpayers' money. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn them in on themselves and say, right, you are now corrupt. You've been told what the problems are in the shape of these questions. You are unable to answer them. You've been given 6 chances. You haven't done it. And instead, you've gone on destroying the British economy and absolutely wrecking the motor car industry. Because, of course, those who piled into electric buggies fashionably in the way that Jaguar did with its ridiculous pink woke adverts,
Oh, yes.
suddenly out of business more or less altogether. And a lot of those who tried to transition into electric buggy manufacture have got their fingers badly burnt, if not by the electric batteries, then by the staggering losses that they're making. And, of course, they've been told they can't go on making the most efficient form of transportation that's ever been devised that's motorized, and that, of course, is the motor car, the proper petrol-fueled motor car. That's what should be continuing. And if we had kept on with that, and the Conservatives in particular had not listened to the siren voices of communism and had not abandoned common sense and had not allowed Miliband in 2008 to introduce the ludicrous Climate Change Act, then we wouldn't have a bankrupt and demoralized and disappearing British motor industry. It would all still be there. And if you wanted to buy a motor car, you would pay a tiny fraction of the prices you're having to pay now for motor cars. Yeah. And so the driver has been royally shafted by the communists, but with the terrifyingly lumpen and stupid acquiescence of the Conservative Party. I was giving a talk in Parliament not so long ago, and a braying Conservative MP for one of the Kent constituencies came bounding up. And he said, of course, I believe in the global warming problem because I'm a physicist, you know. So I said, can you tell me what is the significance of the Planck response in determining how much global warming we may cause? And of course, he looked completely blank. He'd never heard of the Planck response. He didn't know, therefore, the first thing about how you calculate how much global warming we may cause. All he knew was what the Communist Party line was. And as a supposed conservative, he was willing to drift along with it because he had once studied a bit of physics on the back of an envelope when he was 12, probably. And this is how badly governed we now are. And it is your ordinary who gets shafted by all this. And it makes me very angry. And that's why, when I have briefed Nigel on this, I briefed Richard Tice on this, they got the point. But I mustn't claim the credit for reform having come out as it has very, very splendidly, and having said, we are not going to have this nonsense. We're going to abandon net zero altogether. It was a wonderful professor emeritus of physics at Oxford, of geology, I should say, at Oxford, who is extremely widely read. I won't name him because the left will go after him if I do in the savage way that they do. But it was he who, in a series of meetings with Richard Tice, convinced him that doing anything at all about global warming is an utter waste of British taxpayers' money and is an interference with the freedom of drivers to choose what mode of transport they wish to use. So that's how reform came to change its mind. And now, forgive me, we have the Conservative Party under its leader, whose name for the moment I somehow forget, who has just come and said that she too is going to abandon net zero. But she's not doing it because any of her people have been briefed either by me or by the professor or any of the other learned people who know that every word I've just told you is provably true. It's because they're absolutely terrified of being wiped off the map by Nigel Farage, and by copying his policies, they hope that a lot of voters will stick with them and not go to him. Well, that isn't going to work. Every time they adopt one of Nigel's policies, all they're doing is admitting that he was right about this all along. Yeah. And so why vote for the people who are the Johnny-come-latelys who finally worked out that what they've been doing to trash the British economy is really bad for the working people and the ordinary drivers of this country? No, you vote for Nigel Farage if you believe in freedom to motor using petrol or diesel and at an affordable price. You have to vote for reform. Beware all imitations, such as the Conservative Party, which I supported for most of my life, but I can do so no longer. It has lost the plot, it has given up, it has no useful contribution to make any longer to British politics. And so if anyone is hearing this and is worried that Nigel Farage is the fascist and the backer of Hitlerian policies that the communists are trying to say he is, I can assure you, from having known him for the best part of 2 decades now, that there isn't a racist bone in his body anywhere. Nobody is more agreeable to dealing with anyone, regardless of how much suntan they have, regardless of where they come from. The only thing that he rightly insists upon is that if you want to come to this country, there are plenty of routes by which you can do it lawfully. If you come here by an unlawful route, then that fact on its own disqualifies you, as a matter of fact and law, from applying for asylum here. Because if you're coming from France, France is a safe country. Look at them, there they are, being escorted by the Coast Guard onto our shores instead of being turned back and sent away. And they came from France, which in international law is regarded as a safe country.
Yes.
Yeah.
The international treaties to which Britain subscribes on the housing of refugees make it very plain that it is the duty of refugees to apply for asylum in the first safe country to which they come.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have come from France, then we are at the very best the second country that's safe to which they have come, and we have the absolute right at international law to send them straight back to France and no messing about.
Yeah.
So that is what Nigel is going to do. And because the scale of this problem has now become so expensive that it is bankrupting the British economy, you know, we're looking at sort of 250 billion a year in benefits and housing and this and that for all these supernumerary immigrants who have arrived illegally. Beyond any doubt, if they come from France, they've arrived illegally. It's as simple as that. Then he's going to round them up and send them back and say, it's no more Mr. Nice Guy. We, the British people, can't afford it. Our first duty, like it or not, is to 2 categories of people. First, to British people, the indigenous population who are already here, and secondly, to those who have done us the courtesy of making an application for asylum from the country from which they wish to move and have asked whether they can come here. Those are the people to whom we owe loyalty. We owe no loyalty whatsoever to those who arrive from safe countries where they should have applied for asylum but didn't, because we are a softer touch than they are.
The big problem, though, with all of this, Christopher, is that the judiciary, as you say, and the civil service are all linked in this, and they will make it as difficult as possible to enact a sensible immigration policy in this country without major constitutional changes. I mean, David Starkey has talked about this at some length.
Well, I met him the other day and I'm very impressed with him because he has been a champion of restoring the pre-Blair constitutional disposition, which had existed, you're too young to remember, again, for 1,000 years in this country.
Yes.
You know, since Magna Carta, basically. And all of that was thrown out by Tony Blair, and we need to bring it back. And the way I would do this, I think, is by a single bill, which would be introduced under the Emergency Powers Act. And it would simply say, within days of Nigel Farage getting in, we're passing this bill, which will undo all these constitutional abominations that Tony Blair saw through, and restore, once again, the power of the people to govern themselves via the parliament that they elect, rather than that they and parliament should be, as they are now, governed by people that we do not elect. Parliament is no longer sovereign in any useful sense. It's really a redundant institution as it now stands. Well, the first thing that Nigel wants to do is to restore to Parliament the power to make our laws, and no longer leave that in the hands of quangos and bureaucrats and foreign bureaucrats and all these endless international treaties, a lot of which are being grossly misinterpreted by the woke judiciary.
Yeah.
And I think we're probably going to have to grasp the nettle by the horns, and if that isn't mixing too many metaphors, and sack all the judiciary, every single one of them, sling them out, and appoint sensible barristers and solicitors who have gone through the mill and know how the law works and have respect for the law and are not communist. You've got to break this cycle of self-perpetuating, self-appointing judges, which was first introduced by Tony Blair. That's why it's gone woke so quickly, because the communists moved straight in and took it over.
Yeah.
I've had terrible trouble down here with a judge who, I think for purely political reasons, is giving us a very hard time. But if he carries on the way he is, he'll end up in jail, because we eventually went to see a criminal barrister. We said, is what this judge has been doing to us a criminal offence? And he said, oh, yes, unquestionably it is. And so we're drawing up the papers at the moment to get the Crown Prosecution Service and the police involved. And that judge is going to find himself off the bench. And, you know, we've been too passive in allowing these wretched communists to ride roughshod over the law and over any sort of impartiality. That's all got to stop. I speak with some feeling, and I've declared my interest, but it's got to stop. So there are very big changes that are going to have to be made, and they're going to have to be made very fast. I think there's going to have to be a kind of omnium gatherum bill with all manners of measures, in particular, to try to rescue the economy. See, if you stopped doing net zero, Richard Tice said to me that he'd worked out that that would save the economy 30 billion a year. But even the Left-Wing Institute for Fiscal Studies makes it 45 billion. And they, like all the left, aren't allowed to calculate in that figure what are called the opportunity gains and losses. Yeah. You see, if you're making it so expensive to do business, to make anything in this country because of the cost of electricity, that manufacturing is being driven overseas, if you say, right, we're not doing this anymore, and then all the manufacturers start coming back, you gain enormous amounts of revenue, which they aren't allowed to cost in the Treasury figures at the moment. So actually, you would save immediately $1 billion a week at least, probably about 60 billion a year, just by saying bye-bye to net zero. You could save eventually 250 billion a year by saying bye-bye to these illegal immigrants who have come from safe countries and they have absolutely no right here. And there are very big savings right across the board that can be made. There are something like 450 quangos now, which have enormous power, huge spending in the hundreds of billions a year. Very nearly all of them can be wiped out.
Yeah, they're not accountable to anybody either. They don't answer to anybody.
That is a very serious problem. You see, if you're going to have a democratic system, Parliament should not be handing away its powers of government to various bureaucrats. It should retain those powers of governance in its own hands, so that ministers should be answerable for the decisions of their civil servants, whereas these quangos are largely protected from any parliamentary scrutiny. That's not how it's supposed to work in a democratic system. So you're absolutely right about that. So you can see that reform has a formidable amount of work to do to get all this motoring, if that's the right phrase. And I'm glad to say that they are now at a very senior level and with great competence getting on with the necessary preparations. You know, when you see the press sneering and saying Nigel Farage has always just been a gadfly, he's used to standing up and posturing in the European so-called Parliament, and he hasn't ever actually run a country and he wouldn't know where to begin. All of that is nonsense, because he knows that in order to run a great and complex nation like this, you need people who know what they're doing.
You surround yourself with the right people, absolutely.
You surround yourself with people who are willing to put their own wishes and proclivities and propensities and intentions aside and do what the government elected by the British people wishes them to do.
Exactly.
That's be for in future. And that's why Nigel Farage is becoming so popular. That's why the likes of me, who had been until quite recently a lifelong conservative, eventually they stopped asking me to conservative events, even though I was a paid-up conservative. And I realized that they didn't have the courage to fire me from the Conservative Party, because I was beginning to say the Reform Party looks as though it's more worthwhile. They just cut me off.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, that's enough. Time to go to Reform. And so now I'm quietly working with them in a number of ways to see if we can't make Britain governable again and restore the economy before it collapses altogether. The nightmare scenario that I fear is that when you look at the measures that Rachel Reeves from HR at the Bank of England is now inflicting, and she was trying to say she was a top economist. She doesn't know how economics works at all. She hasn't got a clue.
No.
Totally inadequate for the job, which is why she bursts into tears every time she looks at the next crisis in the bond markets, which is, the prices of bonds are now higher than they were at the trust peak. And the trust peak wasn't a genuine peak in the bond markets. It was engineered by a few hostile communist traders using contracts for difference, by which you can manipulate the markets if you know how to do it. And they did this quite deliberately to get rid of her, because they knew that if she got her feet under the table properly in Downing Street, she would transform the economy, she would ditch all this net zero nonsense, she would make Britain great again in the same way that Margaret Thatcher had. So you heard it here first, that she was shafted by a few manipulative dealers on the stock markets internationally, manipulating contracts for difference. It was a criminal offence. We are gathering evidence for that, and in due time, those who perpetrated that removal of a duly appointed British Prime Minister will find themselves behind bars for a very, very, very long time.
Excellent. Interesting, yes. Well, I think we've covered a huge number of topics, and we're sort of been on for an hour and a quarter.
There is no off switch.
do you think it would be wise to have a second episode in the near future?
If you would enjoy it, I certainly would.
Yes,
I find it very agreeable when people are willing to sit and listen to me, as you so kindly have.
You are incredibly knowledgeable and very articulate. So
I just wanted to the information you gave us about the cost of net zero is actually is supported by McKinsey, who did a study, and it's been suppressed now, but McKinsey did a study on the UK cost of net zero, and their estimate was £500 billion a year. The total cost, including the kind of opportunity costs that you've been talking about, $500 billion, 500 billion a year for the 30-year time. No, it's
forgive me,
4 years.
I've seen various figures by McKinsey's. That one is on the high side compared with what most of their reports say. Yeah. But they have very correctly worked out that it is a very large amount of money.
Absolutely.
Or a negligible. This is the point. If you wiped Britain off the map between now and 2050, the world would be cooler by 2050 by 1/1250th of a Celsius degree. That's how silly all this is.
Well, absolutely. When you know that the satellite, the Roy Spencer satellite measurements can vary half a degree and more from 1 month to the next, so you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't be able to confirm whether
No, I mean the whole thing is nonsense, because if even the whole world going to net zero was only going to reduce global temperature by 0.1 Celsius degrees, a tenth of a Celsius degree between now and 2050, and beyond.
That's if everybody was on board with it.
That's if everybody was on board, which of course, the giants, the communist-led and communist-influenced giants of the East are not playing. They've said they're not playing.
No.
They made it absolutely clear at all the climate conference that I used to go to, until I was banned for pointing out these home truths. It was in Qatar. There was a UN climate conference in Qatar, and I was invited to go. And at the end of the conference, right at the end, the chairman of the conference said, "Would anybody else like to say anything?" And so I thought, well, I'm not a national delegate, but I was actually sitting in the chair of the national delegate from, I think it was Burma. or Myanmar as they call it now.
Oh yeah, Myanmar. Yeah.
And there was a button with a microphone in front. So I pressed that. And eventually an official came and said, you do realize you can only speak for 40 seconds. I said, well, that's absolutely fine, yes. So they let me speak, you see. And I said that at that time, there had been no global warming at all for 16 years. It would eventually be nearly 19 years before the warming trend returned. So I said that perhaps it would be a good idea if we worked a little harder on trying to make sure that we get the science correct, rather than simply believing each extremist, alarmist prediction that was made. And that was it. That's all I said, 45 seconds. And I got up to go and was arrested by UN goons, frog-marched out of the room in front of the whole conference, taken to a side room where there was one of these metal tables, painted grey.
Yeah.
The military use. You know the things.
Yeah.
The military will come across these, they all use them.
Yeah.
And there, sitting behind it, was a swarthy individual in a red beret and a very fine moustache. And he said, well, now, in his best Sandhurst accent, for that's where he'd been trained, he said, we have a problem. You see, the UN has debadged you for saying things that your fellow delegates did not wish to hear. And of course, in Qatar, we're not a free country. You can't just say things freely. You can only say things if the authorities say you can. And they would have been very happy if you had endorsed the Communist Party line, but they're not happy because you have dared so compellingly to question it. And so we have a problem. Strictly speaking, now that you have been debadged by the UN from the conference, your visa to be in Qatar at all, which is contingent upon your being badged by the UN, is no longer valid. And I should send you straight to prison. And he had one of these angle poise lamps, which was trained directly on my face. So I said, you do indeed have a problem. He said, oh, no, you do. I said, I don't. If you think that sending me to prison for pointing out the observable and readily verifiable fact that there's been no global warming for 16 years, zero trend for 16 years, then you will find the father and mother of a diplomatic incident coming down around your ears. I can promise you that you will not keep your job. You will be digging holes in the sand. You will no longer be in a smart office with a nice tin military desk trying to bully me. It's not going to work, mate. I'm not frightened of you. So what would you like just as an alternative to the embarrassing and very public end to what has until this point no doubt been a reasonably promising career? And he said, I am not used to be spoken to like this. And I said, well, you are speaking to a peer of the realm, and we do not suffer knaves gladly. And if you are threatening me, then I will threaten you. The difference between us is that my threats are credible and yours are not. So he sighed and he said, well, perhaps, literally like this, he said, I tell you what, if you can get out of Qatar in 3 hours from now, and he looked at his watch and pressed a timer on it, then we'll say no more about it. And so there was a British Airways flight, as it happened, leaving at midnight, because by midnight, if I was still in the country, I'd have been in the nick. And so I got on that flight. It took off, thank God, on time. And all was well. And so it really was. But that's what it is. You see, the international governing class now has utter contempt, even for such tremendously distinguished figures as peers of the realm and the United Kingdom. If they can treat me, or try to treat me like that, imagine how they treat the hapless citizens of their own countries. That's the thing. You can't do it to me because I make a fuss. And if I go on making a fuss for long enough, you will get hurt, unless you have very, very good and legitimate reasons for coming after me. And I try to comply with the laws in whichever country I'm going to, so that that situation doesn't arise any more than it actually arose in that situation. So we have got a problem in that the governing class worldwide has become overweeningly arrogant and contemptuous of ordinary people. If they're contemptuous even of peers of the realm who are known to have a certain amount of articulacy and clout, then imagine what they do to ordinary folk.
Well, there's no opportunity for debate, is there? That's the big thing.
That's the thing. And there is the great hope for the future. Because look at it this way. Supposing that you were a lefty, difficult to imagine, but supposing you were a communist and you were going to have to debate against me on the question of the British economy or climate change or pretty much anything, then you would know, wouldn't you, that you would be very, very likely to lose because you are pursuing a party line regardless of the objective truth. And my team only pursues the objective truth. And the objective truth, that which is true, whether you or I or anyone wishes it to be true or finds it expedient or not fattening to be true. The fact is that's the only thing that matters, is the truth. And this is put, I mean, if you study, say, mathematical or formal logic at Oxford or Cambridge, you learn, among other things, the principle of the unity and universality of truth, which goes like this. Any proposition that is true stands consistent with every proposition that ever was or is or ever shall be true throughout the universe of time and space, from the beginning of the beginning to the end of the end, and from here to the outermost stars. But any proposition that is false, whether or not it stand consistent with other propositions that are false, falls inconsistent with every proposition throughout the universe of time and space that ever was or is or ever shall be true. Virtually no politician knows that principle, and even fewer of them give any respect to it. But there is only one truth. If you're a Catholic like me, you know that comes from God himself, the God of truth, as we call him. Indeed, the Jews first called him the God of truth, and we have borrowed that from them, as we have so much of our moral philosophy. We owe an enormous debt to the Jews for everything that we believe in the Christian faith. Very, very, very nearly all of it comes from them. And if you ever sit, as I once had the honor to do, at the feet of a learned Jewish rabbis, they're all learned, it is like drinking champagne to the sound of trumpets. They're so knowledgeable, and they have a sort of cultured, kindly gentleness with which they propound the truths of the Jewish and very largely of the Christian faith. And I find this very, very engaging, and I find it deplorable that because Hamas, which is a communist front group under the guise of Islam, but it's really a communist front group. It was originated by Russia via its proxy, Iran. And it then deliberately invaded Israel, killed 1,300 people and took several hostages. And they were deliberately trying to provoke the Israelis into defending themselves, which is what the Israelis have been doing ever since. And now you have this useless communist, Starmer, who was a communist in his youth and has not changed his spots, coming out and saying, we're going to recognize Palestine. But Palestine isn't a country. There was Judea, one side of the Jordan, and Samaria on the other. And the word Palestine actually comes from the Roman word Philistine, and the Philistines were niekulturni, as the Russians would call them, entirely uncultured. They were brutish, and the Romans had complete contempt for them. It was they who named them the Philistines, and that's where the word Palestine comes from today. There is no such thing as Palestine. There never was, and there never will be. It's just a fiction made up by enemies of the West, made up by enemies of Israel. And it's time that these home truths were spelt out in our Mark Stream news medium, but they just won't get to the bottom of anything. This is what so annoys me. They will not find out what is the truth. You know, at the most famous show trial in history, Pontius Pilate, who was the judge at that trial, said to the Lord of Life, "Quid est veritas?" What is the truth? Now, he, being a totalitarian, didn't actually care to know the answer from the one person who could have told him what the answer was. But he flounced out once he'd said that. But what had the Lord of Life said to provoke that question? He had said this: "Ego in hoc natus sum, et ad hoc veni in mundum, ut testimonium per habeam veritati. To this end was I born, for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth." That was the mission statement of the Lord of Life himself, and that's what we should be following. And because the universities, which were in most Western countries Christian foundations originally, have gone away from their Christian roots, gone away from the notion that the objective truth is what it is the duty of any academic researcher to try to find and then to speak. They've gone away from that. And so academia has become utterly corrupt.
Yes.
But because they will no longer debate with me, and this has been going on for many, many years now, though I was once taking part in a debate in Australia on live TV, and they tried all the academics who said, you know, Monckton's wrong about climate change. They said, fine, come in and debate with him. Not one of them would, because they all knew that
Yes.
I knew what the truth was and would speak it, and that they would be left gasping like stranded fish, because all they know is the Communist Party line, which is of no great interest, subspecie eternitatis, at all.
Yeah.
And so because they won't debate, and because the left are very, very actively suppressing free speech, even in this country, the
Yes.
cradle of free speech,
Yeah.
they're deliberately doing away with it. And they're saying, we are not going to allow the likes of Monckton to say that there basically isn't a problem with the climate. It's all based on a series of both scientific and physical and economic and resource allocation mistakes. No, we're not going to allow him to say that, because if he says that, he will win the argument against us and we will lose the point. So what you're getting by this vicious attack on free speech, which is being mounted by the present communist government in this country, is an admission that they now know with a bitterness in the depths of their hearts that they are wrong and wrong about everything. And wrong about everything. After all, it's only those who are wrong about everything that won't want to debate for fear of being shown up in their wrongness. And that's why the left, which thinks it triumphs because it now controls the judiciary and the unions and the churches and the bishops and the civil service, etc., the BBC and all those unspeakable media. And all other schools, of course, are very, very good. The entire education establishment has been taken over. But the fact that they have done this means that they know, and they know with bitterness in their hearts, that they are wrong about everything, because otherwise they would be as cheerful debating with me as I am on those very, very rare occasions these days when I get the chance to debate with them. So they know they're wrong, and once they know they're wrong, it's all over bar the shouting. They can keep the clattering train going for just a little bit longer. But the days of the hate-filled, thanatist death cult, that is the left, which will kill babies in the womb of their mothers right up to birth without even giving the baby an anesthetic, that will kill old people who happen to have got a cold and feel a bit miserable about life and say, well, perhaps I'll just take a big pill and disappear. They, kill, kill, kill. That's what all these thanatist death cults are all about.
Yeah.
That's what the Labour Party has always been about. They just want to kill as many people as they can. They want to destroy the British economy, and it is not accidental.
Yeah.
And after all, the economic effects of killing the little children of your own race are very dire. As they've discovered in China, South Korea, North Korea, various other countries now, where the birth rate has plummeted. But you see, in the Islamic world, they don't believe in killing their babies. And I was driven home from Bristol Parkway Station the other day by a guy from Somalia called Abdi. And he said, yeah, he said, I've got a family, I've got 9 children. And I said, how absolutely marvelous. You've got a proper sized family. And he was tickled pink because he doesn't normally get that reaction from his And so, they are breeding, they're outbreeding us, literally. So not only are they coming in on every boat, they're now outbreeding us because they don't kill their babies. And in that, they are right not to kill their babies. And if they gain politically by not killing their babies, well, I say good luck to them. And we should emulate their good practice in this respect. Because I have recently seen some figures which I'm about to try to verify with the Office for National Statistics, that 1/4 of the entire UK population is now Muslim. 1/4. That is how fast immigration, particularly from Muslim countries, which is where most of them come from, has been running, and how fast also they have been producing children once they get here. So within a much shorter time scale than 2050, which is what the Office for National Statistics thinks will be the time when the Muslim population becomes the overwhelming majority, that could happen a lot sooner. And the British people did not vote for that very big change. That is a very big change, and it's one which has been operated by stealth, by the Home Office, which itself now has many Muslims in it, pursuing policies to get more of their own into the country. They even now publish a booklet, which you're given when you come off these rubber boats from France, which says, here is how you can take the British taxpayer for a ride. It's virtually called that. And it tells you how to get a free lawyer at the expense of the state, how to get free accommodation, a free phone, everything, all free education for your children. Bring all your children in once you've got here. This is how you do it. These are the left-wing lawyers you go to, and they will do it all for you. And the left-wing judges will rubber stamp it all, and you can do what you like. The Home Office, which is supposed to be controlling immigration, is actively promoting it. And the Conservative Party has had practically nothing to say about this reform. As you can imagine, steam is coming out of every orifice. They're furious that the Home Office should be actively promoting a permanent and very radical change in the composition of our country. You see, the Judeo-Christian disposition is a much gentler, easier going disposition than the Islamic disposition. See, in the Islamic disposition, if you are Islamic and you decide on looking for historical criticisms of the origins of Islam, which show that the official narrative that they give in Islam is historically completely incorrect. There was no Muhammad. The first time the word Muhammad appears is actually all the way back 1,500 years before their Muhammad was said to have been in Mecca or Mecca. And that was in an Ugaritic inscription, which was found by accident on the Mediterranean coast of Syria when a farmer was driving along his tractor and he fell through a hole and he found a complete ancient city. That was the city of Ugarit, and they had a Semitic language called Ugaritic. And that's where you first see the consonant MHMD, Muhammad. And of course, there are no vowels in the earlier versions of any of these Semitic languages. They were added much later, typically at the end of the 7th century, so that when the Quran was said to have been composed by the Sahaba, who were the companions of the Prophet, and by the Tabi'un, who were the next generation after those who had actually known the Prophet personally, none of those people existed. They were all from the 9th to the 13th centuries, not the early 7th century when Muhammad was supposed to be alive. And there was no Mecca in the early 7th century. It did not exist. And all of the qiblas, the directions of prayer, which are built into the early mosque, including the one at Medina, they don't point, that one doesn't point southward towards Mecca. It points northward towards Petra. That was the original Islamic center. not Mecca at all. And if you try to get a license, I'm an archaeologist among other things, to dig anywhere in Mecca, you can't get it unless you are Islamic, because they know that you will find nothing of the early civilization that the Islamicists try to say existed at that time. And essentially, this is really interesting. The work was done by a scholar from Germany. And when you get religious scholars from Germany, they are extraordinarily meticulous in their research, as you can imagine, very, very thorough. And there's a guy called Lühling, who in 1970, when I went up to Cambridge, he wrote a thesis for his doctorate, which said that about somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the Quran is actually gibberish. Nobody really knows what it means. It literally makes no sense. And these are known, even among Islamic scholars, as the dark verses, because they can't interpret them. So this German scholar decided to go back to the 6 original fragments of what eventually became the Quran. It was eventually put together as a single document right at the end of the 7th century, at the very earliest, and most versions were actually much later even than that, long after Muhammad's time. But Lühling studied these texts that nobody could understand in the Quran itself, and he found, to his astonishment, that if you didn't use the Arabic diacritical marks, which supply about a third of the consonants in Arabic, and also the dots which stand for vowels, and you take all those out and you start again and put different ones in, you find that what you have in all these dark verses are early Christian texts and sermons and psalms and hymns. And nobody knew until he did this research. So outstanding this research that he was awarded the title of Eximium Opus, which is a piece of research so outstanding that it instantly qualifies you to go straight to a professorship without having to do any doctoral teaching or further. And from then on, he never worked again, because the establishment in the universities ganged up, and they said, yes, we cannot fault your research, but your research comes to a conclusion which does not accord with the Communist Party line, and therefore we are not going to allow you to work. And he was on the dole for most of his life, until eventually an English translation of his thesis was done, and that went all over the world, and people were absolutely astonished. But if you have never heard of Lühling or his research, I should not be in the least surprised, because the Marxstream news media in this country will not tell you any of this.
Yeah,
Fascinating stuff. Yeah,
I think we should wind up there, but I'll just read a quote to you from a philosopher called Ayn Rand. She said, Fascism and communism are not two opposites, but two rival gangs fighting over the same territory. Both are variants of statism, based on the collectivist principle that man is the rightless slave of the state.
She wrote with beautiful clarity, and I think the best of all her works is the short one called Anthem, because it gives the free market and small government and low taxes and maximum freedom for the ordinary voter. It gives it an inspirational quality. Yes. And in fact, an almost poetic quality. I began noticing that in the many purple passages in that very short book, Anthem by Ayn Rand, A-Y-N-R-A-N-D, she was using iambic pentameters, just like Shakespeare used to use. Ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. And these occur over and over again in that book. She was, I think, unconsciously being poetic in her writing. It's a very, very engaging book, charming story. And so if you haven't read Anthem by Ayn Rand, I do recommend it. It's a lovely book. And it shows that, you know, the free market is not this red in tooth and claw hostile environment that the left like to make out. It is the best way to allocate resources so that everybody gets a fair share. And of course, you get far more resources under a free market than you do under any other system of government.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, in China and Russia now, they have a fascist system of economics with a communist system of government. And the fascist system of economics works marginally better than the communist system of economics that they both had before. But of course, the free market system works best, but they can't bring themselves to do that because it would mean the government taking far less power and control.
But
So,
our government is trying to go in that direction.
Well, this is the trouble. You have, and unfortunately, in just about all the parties, Reform is now the only party that has a philosophical approach to these questions that says the people shall rule, the people shall be free, the voters shall decide who governs them, and those who govern them shall decide legislation because we have elected them to do that. So that we, the people, wear the trousers once again. That, in essence, is what Reform is all about. That's why I like it so much, because that's what Margaret Thatcher was all about. It was about empowering ordinary folk to get on their bike, do well, set up their own companies, own their own trade unions, so that rather than being pushed around by communists.
Yeah, it's the difference between ruling us and ruling for us, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly that. That's very nicely put.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, this climate thing is all part of this nonsense. You know, there's no greater way to introduce universal servitude than to say to the lower classes that they may no longer move about because you can't have a proper car. If you have an electric buggy, it's going to cost you a lot more to run than a real car. It's going to, you have to stop every few hours and plug it in for hours at a time to charge it up again. And, you know, this is not a mature technology.
No.
And yet, you know, the wretched communist bureaucrats just say, you know, we are going to impose this on the people because we think it's good for the planet and it's good for them. Well, no, it isn't. It should be a matter of free choice, no subsidies to these electric buggies, no subsidies to petrol cars either. Let the free market decide what the price of these things is and let them compete honestly. And on that basis, virtually nobody would buy an electric buggy. The one electric thing I would buy would be, have you come across the phenomenon of an electric unicycle? These are absolutely wonderful. You stand on a pair of pedals and you have a wheel underneath you with a couple of gyroscopes and some batteries, and you can go, I mean, the big ones you can get now, you can go up to 90 miles an hour. Not that at my age one would want to do that, officer, but but the one country in the world where these things are not lawful is Britain. Everywhere else, you can drive around on them. You don't need a license. You don't need to be taxed. You don't need to be insured because you're not going to do anyone any harm on one of those. They're too small. You know, you might hurt yourself. You're not going to hurt anybody else. But now you've got to get third-party insurance, and you've got to get a license, and you've got to get this, that, and the other. And so Britain is the one country in the world where you can't have an electric unicycle. And this is very symptomatic of Britain today. In the old days, in this country, whatever is the way the French would put it is this: whatever was not obligatoire, you could do your own thing. But now, whatever is not interdit, what is not forbidden altogether, is obligatoire. There's no grey areas in between. You will have to do, in all matters, exactly what the state tells you, and not do exactly what the state tells you not to do. That's not freedom. That's not democracy. That's not how it's supposed to work. And it's that sense on the part of the British people that they have had their freedoms suddenly taken away by the fascisto, communist, thanatist, totalitarian left. And of course, Islamist as well, because unfortunately, you know, the extremism that is peddled in some of the Islamic factions, not all of them, is very dire. And, you know, we are supposed to be a free country. We want our freedom back. That's why you vote for Nigel Farage, because he's going to get us our freedom back. The big worry I have is twofold. One, that the left will panic and try to crash the economy just after calling an early election. So they call an early election knowing the whole thing's going down the tubes because they run it so badly. Nigel Farage comes in. He's holding the baby when the whole thing crashes. He is then flung out of office and in come the communists, red in tooth and claw. Some of them are actually working to try to achieve that. And the other worry is, of course, the Charlie Kirk problem. That if Nigel is assassinated, there is nobody of comparable stature who could then lead Reform to victory.
Yeah.
And, it's always very difficult for a leader to make provision for his own succession.
Yes.
And most leaders never do. And that can often lead to great dislocations. But, if we lost Nigel Farage now to one of these snipers or poisoners or, the communists with umbrellas tipped with whatever it was, plutonium 238, that's not going to be funny.
And and on top of that as well, his security detail was recently slashed, wasn't it?
They said they were going to cut it by 3/4.
That's right.
Which was pure spite on the part of the communists, pure spite. And so he very splendidly said, right, you can cut it by 100%. I will get some donors to provide all the security that I need. I'm not going to have 2 lots of people fighting over how I'm going to be kept secure.
And that's exactly what he's done. He's got sponsors.
So that's what he's done, and quite rightly too.
Yeah.
And I think it disgraceful, given the known risk from, as we've just seen with Charlie Kirk, whom I met some years ago when he came over to Britain to do a bit of fundraising. And I liked the cut of his jib very much. He was talking good sense to these various leftists on the undergraduates on the campuses in the universities in the States, and making mincemeat of them and setting up free market centers called Turning Point USA in every university, because the Republicans were no longer bothering. And so he did it. And so now there is a proper conservative presence once again, a free market presence on the campuses in the United States. And it's single-handedly, it was he who did that. That's why they had to get rid of him, because they didn't want him going on doing this.
Yeah.
And he was so articulate and so compassionate when dealing with these muddle-headed drones who had been trained in the Communist Party line and could not go even half an inch off script without getting lost.
Yeah.
He was very gentle with them most of the time. If they tried to get antsy with him, he'd hit back. But otherwise, he was very, very gentle, very respectful, and very knowledgeable. And it's people like that we can't afford to lose. And Nigel is one of those. We certainly can't afford to lose him. It's really important that he should be properly defended against the enormous, what I now think is the enormous risk that somebody will try to take him out.
As indeed should any politician, really.
Well, given the number of politicians that have been killed in recent years in this country, it is getting to be a problem. And in virtually every case, it is the far left that are doing the killing. And it's the same point we were making earlier. When they realize that everything else has failed and they've lost the debate, they will actually kill their opponents. That's what the left are. They're a death cult. And that's why you should never, ever, ever vote for the Labour Party ever again, nor the Greens, nor the so-called Liberal, so-called Democrats, who are neither, nor the Scottish nationalists, nor the Welsh nationalists. All of these are Communist Front organisations. All of these hate the British people and their achievements with a passionate and abiding loathing. You should reject them root and branch. Everyone should now vote for reform, and especially if you're a driver, because you can count upon reform not to do what Kemi Badenoch did and say, oh, well, of course, we still accept climate change as a problem, but we're not going to do anything about it. Nigel Farage, having been properly instructed by this wonderful professor at Oxford, is simply saying the whole thing is nonsense. We're not playing, and we're going to ditch the whole thing. That's the proper policy that should be pursued on the climate question. And that would give motorists once again in Britain the freedom to buy whatever kind of car, or even perhaps one day electric unicycle that they may wish to buy at their choice. And, the electric cars will be more expensive. They'll be more difficult to run. They lose their value very, 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 very fast. If you buy one new, then by the time you've got it out of the showroom, it's worth about a quarter of what you paid for it. They have no resale value at all, and they just can't shift them. And so why should motorists be penalized in this way? Why should they be told, we are going to tell you how often and by what mode of transport you can and can't travel about, and how far you can go. And we are going to charge you for every mile that you travel. And we are going to say you have to be in 15-minute cities where you can go and get your baked beans without getting into a car at all. No, all of this is a gross interference in the free market. And it is time that it was all stopped. And reform is going to stop it.
Okay, I think we should. We've gone for an awful long time now.
That's absolutely brilliant, guest. Yeah,
absolutely brilliant. We will come back to you to review what's going on in, I don't know, 5 or 6 months' time. But
By all means.
Really appreciate the time you've taken to talk to us. It's been extremely interesting, very, very enjoyable.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely amazing.
Anyway, thank you both very much. And
thank you.
God bless you for the work you're doing to stand up for our drivers, wherever they may be, in whatever vehicles they wish to travel.
And thank you for acknowledging it. Yeah, thank you.
God bless all of you as well.
Thank
the
you.
Association of British Drivers.
Thanks, Richard. Cheers.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.